The year is 52 BCE, and inside the fortified hilltop town of Alesia, 80,000 warriors are eating their last horses. Outside, Julius Caesar commands 60,000 Roman legionaries constructing the most audacious military engineering project the ancient world has ever seen. A double wall of fortifications stretching for 25 miles, designed to trap the Gallic army inside while simultaneously defending against a relief force of 250,000 warriors converging from every corner of Gaul. This is not just a siege. This is the moment when the fate of Western civilization hangs in the balance, when one brilliant general's insane gamble will either crown him as Rome's greatest commander or see his severed head paraded through Gallic villages. What happened at Alesia in those desperate autumn weeks would echo through 2,000 years of military history, yet the true story of betrayal, desperation, and a ruthless calculation that condemned tens of thousands to starvation remains far more brutal and complex than the legends suggest. The man trapped on that hill, the young Gallic king named Vercingetorix, had already accomplished what no one thought possible. He had united the fractious tribes of Gaul, defeated Caesar in open battle, and ignited a rebellion that threatened to destroy Roman power north of the Alps forever. The man building those walls, Julius Caesar, was fighting not just for victory but for his political survival, knowing that defeat here would mean his enemies in Rome would tear him apart before he could even make it home. Between these two men, between these two armies, between civilization and barbarism as the Romans saw it, everything was about to be decided. But to understand how we arrived at this desperate moment, we need to go back 8 years, to when Julius Caesar first arrived in Gaul as governor, a politically ambitious patrician drowning in debt and desperate for glory. Caesar came to Gaul in 58 BCE not as a conqueror but as a politician in exile, fleeing his creditors and enemies in Rome, appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul through political maneuvering and the support of his allies Pompey and Crassus in the First Triumvirate. He was 42 years old, deeply in debt to the tune of millions of sesterces, and acutely aware that his only path to political dominance in Rome was through military glory and the wealth that came with conquest. Gaul was perfect. Wealthy, disorganized, filled with tribal conflicts he could exploit, and conveniently threatened by Germanic tribes whose migrations gave him the legal pretext he needed to justify military intervention. The Helvetii tribes' attempted migration through Roman territory in 58 BCE handed Caesar his excuse on a silver platter, and he seized it with both hands. What followed was not a single war but a series of campaigns that would last 8 years, devastating Gaul, killing an estimated 1 million Gauls, enslaving another million, and transforming Caesar from a politician playing soldier into one of history's most formidable military commanders. He fought the Helvetii, the Germanic tribes under Ariovistus, the Belgae in the north, the maritime tribes of Brittany, and launched punitive expeditions across the Rhine into Germania and across the Channel into Britain, expeditions designed more for their propaganda value in Rome than for any strategic purpose. Year after year, Caesar's dispatches flooded back to Rome, carefully crafted commentaries that portrayed him as the defender of civilization against the barbarian hordes, the man extending Roman power into lands even Pompey the Great had never touched. The Roman people devoured these accounts, thrilled by tales of strange lands and fierce warriors, while Caesar's soldiers grew rich on plunder and his officers became devoted to a commander who shared the hardships of campaign and rewarded loyalty with gold and land. But Caesar made a critical miscalculation. He thought he could conquer Gaul without truly defeating it, that superior Roman military organization and divide-and-conquer tactics would be enough to break tribal resistance permanently. He was wrong. By 53 BCE, after 6 years of Roman occupation, resentment in Gaul had reached a boiling point. The Gallic tribes had initially been divided, some allying with Rome against traditional enemies, others resisting from the start, but Roman taxation, the seizure of land, the taking of hostages, and the brutal suppression of resistance had created something unprecedented: a shared sense of Gallic identity and a common hatred of Roman rule. The catalyst came in the winter of 53 to 52 BCE, when Roman merchants and tax collectors were massacred in the town of Cenabum, modern-day Orleans, and the rebellion spread like wildfire across Gaul. The tribes needed a leader, someone young and charismatic enough to inspire warriors but skilled enough to challenge Caesar's military genius, and they found him in an unlikely figure. Vercingetorix, a young nobleman of the Arverni tribe whose own father had once sought to make himself king of all Gaul and had been executed for his ambition. Vercingetorix was probably in his early 30s, tall and imposing according to later Roman descriptions, a skilled horseman and warrior who understood something crucial that other Gallic leaders had missed. You could not beat the Romans at their own game. The traditional Gallic way of war, mass charges of brave but undisciplined warriors seeking individual glory, was suicide against Roman discipline and engineering. Vercingetorix proposed something radical: a scorched earth strategy, avoiding pitched battles, harassing Roman supply lines, burning Gallic towns and crops to deny the Romans resources, and waiting for hunger and frustration to destroy Caesar's army. It was a strategy that required enormous sacrifice, asking the Gauls to destroy their own homes and fields, but Vercingetorix convinced them it was the only way to win. He was elected commander-in-chief of the combined Gallic forces, given unprecedented authority over warriors from dozens of tribes, and immediately put his strategy into action. Caesar, wintering south of the Alps when the rebellion erupted, made a desperate winter march through snow-covered mountains to reach his legions, a feat his men thought impossible and that caught the Gauls off guard. But once the campaign season opened in the spring of 52 BCE, Vercingetorix's strategy began to work devastatingly well. The Romans besieged the fortified town of Avaricum, modern-day Bourges, one of the most beautiful cities in Gaul, and Vercingetorix argued it should be burned, but the local Bituriges tribe begged to defend it, and he reluctantly agreed. The Romans took Avaricum after a brutal siege, massacred its 40,000 inhabitants in an orgy of violence that Caesar himself admitted got out of control. But the victory was Pyrrhic because it consumed precious time while Vercingetorix's main army escaped intact. Caesar then moved against Gergovia, the fortified capital of Vercingetorix's own Arverni tribe, perched on a plateau in central Gaul, and here the young Gallic commander set a trap. Vercingetorix used the terrain brilliantly, occupying multiple defensive camps on surrounding heights, and when Caesar attempted a limited assault to capture one of these camps, the attack spiraled out of control as his soldiers, scenting easy victory, pushed forward against orders. Vercingetorix counterattacked, and the Romans broke, fleeing down the hillside in disorder while Gallic cavalry cut them down. Caesar lost 700 legionaries and 46 centurions in a single day, a devastating defeat that shattered his aura of invincibility. Word of the Roman defeat spread across Gaul, and tribes that had remained neutral or even allied with Rome now joined the rebellion. The Aedui, Rome's most important Gallic allies for generations, switched sides and massacred Roman supply convoys, cutting Caesar off from his bases in southern Gaul. For the first time in his 8 years of Gallic campaigning, Julius Caesar faced the real possibility of total defeat, of being trapped in hostile territory with his army disintegrating and his enemies in Rome sharpening their knives for his return. He needed a decisive victory, and he needed it fast. Vercingetorix, flush with success and under pressure from his tribal allies who wanted to finish the Romans in open battle now that momentum had swung to the Gauls, made the fatal decision to abandon his winning strategy. The two armies met in the open plains near Dijon, and Vercingetorix launched his vaunted Gallic cavalry, 15,000 horsemen, the finest warriors from across Gaul, against Caesar's cavalry. The Gallic cavalry had defeated the Romans repeatedly throughout the campaign, but Caesar had quietly recruited Germanic cavalry from across the Rhine, fierce warriors who fought with a savage effectiveness that shocked the Gauls. In the swirling cavalry battle that followed, the Germanic horsemen systematically destroyed the Gallic cavalry, chasing them from the field and then, in a devastating tactical innovation, dismounted and attacked the Gallic infantry in the flanks while Caesar's legions pinned them from the front. The Gallic army broke and fled, and Vercingetorix, watching his strategy unravel and his cavalry shattered, made a decision that would doom him and change history. He retreated to the fortified hilltop town of Alesia. It seemed like a reasonable choice. Alesia was one of the strongest fortifications in Gaul, situated on a steep plateau called Mont Auxois, surrounded by rivers and valleys that made direct assault nearly impossible, provisioned for a long siege, and positioned where relief forces from across Gaul could converge to trap Caesar between the town's garrison and a relieving army. Vercingetorix had 80,000 warriors with him, and he sent messengers galloping across Gaul calling every tribe to send their warriors to Alesia for the final confrontation. He expected Caesar to either assault the town directly, which would be suicidal, or to attempt a siege, which would leave the Romans vulnerable to attack from the rear when the relief army arrived. What Vercingetorix did not expect, what no one in the ancient world could have reasonably expected, was what Julius Caesar actually did next. Caesar looked at Alesia, looked at his 60,000 legionaries, calculated the numbers and the odds, and decided to besiege both armies at once. He would build a ring of fortifications around Alesia to trap Vercingetorix and his 80,000 warriors inside, and then he would build a second ring of fortifications facing outward to defend against the 250,000 Gauls he knew were coming. It was insane. The Romans would be caught between two massive armies with nowhere to retreat, outnumbered more than 4-1 overall, dependent entirely on engineering and discipline to survive. But Caesar understood something about war that made the plan feasible. The Gauls could not sustain their massive armies in the field for long. They lacked the logistical organization to feed and coordinate hundreds of thousands of warriors, and if he could hold out long enough, their relief army would disintegrate from hunger and internal tribal rivalries. The circumvallation, the inner ring of fortifications, would starve Vercingetorix into submission, and the contravallation, the outer ring, would keep the relief army at bay while starvation did its work. It would require his legionaries to build the most extensive field fortifications in ancient history, working under constant harassment from Gallic sorties, racing against time before the relief army arrived. But if it worked, it would end the war at a single stroke. Caesar set his legionaries to work, and what they built in the following weeks remains one of the most impressive engineering achievements in military history. The inner circumvallation stretched for 11 miles in a complete circuit around Alesia, following the contours of the surrounding valleys and ridges. It began with a trench 15 feet wide with vertical sides, filled with water diverted from nearby rivers to make crossing impossible without bridging. Behind that came two more trenches, each 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep, the inner one also flooded where possible. Behind the trenches rose a rampart 12 feet high, constructed from the earth excavated from the trenches, topped with a wooden palisade that added another 6 feet of height, bringing the total defensive wall to 18 feet tall. Towers were built every 80 feet along the wall, rising even higher to provide platforms for artillery and archers. But Caesar wasn't finished. Between the trenches and the wall, he ordered his engineers to construct a killing field of obstacles designed to break up and channel any Gallic assault. First came 5 rows of sharpened branches interwoven and angled toward the enemy, called Sippi, impossible to pull out because they were embedded in trenches and tied together. In front of these, pits 3 feet deep were dug in a checkerboard pattern and filled with sharpened stakes hardened by fire. The pits then camouflaged with brush. The Romans called these lilia, lilies, because of their pattern. And in front of everything, wooden stakes with iron hooks attached were embedded in the ground and hidden in shallow trenches, designed to impale the feet and legs of charging warriors. The Romans called these stimuli goads, like those used to drive cattle. All of this, 11 miles of it, built while Vercingetorix's warriors sallied out repeatedly trying to disrupt the work. Built while the legionaries remained on half rations to preserve supplies. Built while scouts brought word that the Gallic relief army was mustering and marching toward them. And when the circumvallation was complete, Caesar ordered his exhausted legionaries to do it all again, building an outer contravallation facing the opposite direction, this one 14 miles long to account for the wider perimeter needed to give the Romans room to maneuver and store supplies. 25 miles of fortifications in total, completed in about a month, an engineering achievement that military historians still study today for its audacity and effectiveness. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the Roman walls rising and understood, perhaps for the first time, the full scope of the trap he had walked into. He had provisioned for a siege, but not for 80,000 warriors plus the civilian population of Alesia, and the food was running out faster than expected. He tried desperate breakout attempts, launching his cavalry in a massive sortie to cut through the Roman lines before the fortifications were complete. But Caesar's Germanic cavalry intercepted them, and the brutal fight that followed ended with the Gallic horsemen retreating back into Alesia, many cut down by Roman archers as they tried to cross back through gaps in the still incomplete walls. Vercingetorix made a ruthless calculation. He sent his cavalry out again, but this time not to fight, to escape through gaps in the Roman lines and ride to every corner of Gaul, urging the tribes to send every warrior they could muster to Alesia immediately. The horsemen made it through, dispersing into the countryside, carrying messages that painted the situation in desperate terms. If Vercingetorix fell, the rebellion was over, and Roman vengeance would be total. Then Vercingetorix addressed the problem of feeding 80,000 warriors with dwindling supplies. He expelled the civilians of Alesia, old men, women, and children, sending them out of the town with whatever possessions they could carry, hoping the Romans would let them through the lines and that this would both conserve food and perhaps stir some pity or tactical complication for Caesar. It was a calculated move born of desperation, and what happened next revealed the absolute ruthlessness that made Caesar one of history's most effective and most feared commanders. The refugees from Alesia, perhaps 10 to 15,000 people, walked down from the plateau toward the Roman lines, expecting to be taken prisoner or allowed to pass through to the countryside beyond. Caesar ordered his soldiers to do nothing. The refugees reached the Roman fortifications and begged to be taken as slaves, anything to be fed, but Caesar gave strict orders. No one was to be admitted through the lines. The refugees were trapped in no man's land between Alesia and the Roman walls, and there they stayed. Days passed, then weeks. The refugees, dying of starvation and exposure, cried out to the Gauls on the walls above to take them back in, but Vercingetorix could not afford to feed them. That was why he had expelled them in the first place. They cried out to the Romans to enslave them or kill them, anything but this slow death, but Caesar remained unmoved. Some refugees tried to approach Gallic scouting parties outside the Roman perimeter, but most were in the dead zone between the walls, visible from both sides, dying slowly while two armies watched. It was psychological warfare of the most brutal kind, demonstrating to everyone watching that Caesar would not blink, would not compromise, would sacrifice any principle of mercy to achieve victory. The refugees died in the ditches and gullies around Alesia, and their bodies remained unburied as a warning. Inside the town, Vercingetorix's warriors looked down at the corpses of their own people and understood that they were facing an enemy who would not yield, who would turn human compassion itself into a weapon if it served his purpose. The Gallic relief army could not arrive soon enough. And the relief army was coming, the largest army Gaul had ever assembled. The tribal councils met and made their levies. The Aedui and their allies sent 35,000 warriors, the Arverni and their allies sent 35,000 more, the tribes of the Atlantic coast sent 20,000, the Sequani sent 12,000, the Helvetii 10,000, and contingents poured in from every corner of Gaul, warriors who had never fought alongside each other, led by chieftains who distrusted each other, speaking different dialects and following different customs. But, united by the knowledge that if Vercingetorix fell, Rome would crush Gallic independence forever. Ancient sources claim the relief army numbered 240,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, and while this number is probably exaggerated by ancient standards of counting, the army was undoubtedly massive, dwarfing anything the Gauls had previously fielded. The relief army was commanded by Commius, king of the Atrebates, who had once been Caesar's ally before switching sides, along with 3 other chiefs including a cousin of Vercingetorix. They marched toward Alesia, and when Caesar's scouts brought word of their approach, the situation became exactly what Caesar had planned for and what any sane military commander would have avoided. 60,000 Romans trapped between 80,000 Gauls inside Alesia and 240,000 Gauls approaching from outside. The ratio was more than 5 to 1 against Rome, and there was no retreat, no reinforcements coming, no clever maneuver that could extract the Romans from their self-imposed trap. Caesar had gambled everything on his fortifications, his legionaries' discipline, and the Gauls' inability to coordinate their overwhelming numbers effectively. Now he would find out if he had calculated correctly or if he had engineered his own destruction. The relief army arrived and camped on a hill about a mile from the outer Roman fortifications, close enough to be visible from Alesia, and when Vercingetorix's warriors saw them, they erupted in cheers, believing deliverance was at hand. The next day, the relief army's cavalry advanced to test the Roman defenses, probing for weak points, and Caesar deployed his cavalry in front of the walls to meet them. The battle raged from noon until sunset, thousands of horsemen swirling in combat across the plains, and once again Caesar's Germanic cavalry proved superior, pushing the Gauls back and pursuing them toward their camp until darkness ended the fighting. But the cavalry battle was just a prelude. The real assault came the following night. The Gauls understood that coordinated attacks from inside and outside simultaneously would force the Romans to divide their forces, so they planned a 2-pronged assault under cover of darkness. At midnight, the relief army moved forward in silence, carrying fascines, bundles of sticks, to fill the Roman ditches and scaling ladders to climb the walls, while from inside Alesia, Vercingetorix led his warriors down from the plateau to assault the inner fortifications. The plan was sound. Hit the Romans from both sides at once in darkness, overwhelm them through sheer numbers before they could coordinate a response. What the Gauls didn't fully appreciate was how thoroughly Caesar had prepared for exactly this scenario. The night attack began with a tremendous war cry from the relief army, a roar designed to signal the attack to Vercingetorix inside Alesia and to terrify the Romans. All along the 14-mile outer wall, Romans scrambled to their positions in the darkness, guided by trumpet calls and the shouts of centurions. The Gauls advanced, throwing their fascines into the ditches, discovering the hidden obstacles the hard way as warriors stumbled into the Lilia pits and impaled themselves on hidden stakes, their screams adding to the chaos. Those who made it through the obstacle field reached the ditches and began trying to fill them while Roman artillery opened fire from the towers, ballistae and catapults shooting blind into the darkness toward the sounds of the Gallic host, every shot finding targets in the packed masses. Archers on the walls shot fire arrows to illuminate the killing ground, and what they revealed was a nightmare of bodies and struggling warriors trapped in the Roman obstacles. At the same time, on the inner wall, Vercingetorix's assault hit with equal fury, warriors scrambling up from the valley floor with ladders and grappling hooks, trying to scale the fortifications while Romans stabbed down at them with spears and dropped stones on their heads. Caesar rode along the interior of his fortifications, moving from crisis point to crisis point, visible in his distinctive scarlet cloak, directing reserves to wherever the Gauls threatened to break through. The fighting raged for hours in the darkness, neither side able to see more than a few yards, the battle fragmenting into hundreds of small desperate melees along the walls. But as dawn approached, the Gallic attacks faltered. They had not broken through anywhere, and they had suffered terrible casualties in the obstacle fields and ditches. As light spread across the battlefield, the relief army pulled back to their camp, and Vercingetorix's warriors retreated back up to Alesia, both sides bloodied but the Roman lines intact. Caesar had survived the first coordinated assault, but he knew this was just the beginning. The Gauls spent the next day building siege equipment, enormous wicker screens to protect warriors as they filled the ditches, more scaling ladders, hooks to pull down Roman palisades, while inside Alesia, Vercingetorix rationed the last of the food. Both sides understood that time was running out. The Gauls could not sustain their massive relief army in the field indefinitely, and inside Alesia, starvation was becoming acute. Everything would be decided in the next major assault. The Gallic commanders studied the Roman fortifications carefully, looking for a weak point, and they found one. On the northern side of the Roman perimeter, there was a section where the terrain made it impossible for the Romans to complete their fortifications fully. A hill called Mont Rey was too large to include inside the perimeter, but close enough that the Romans had to build their wall over broken, uneven ground, and the fortifications there were weaker than elsewhere. The garrison spread thinner because the Romans simply didn't have enough men to defend every mile of wall with equal strength. The Gauls chose 60,000 of their best warriors for a special assault force, gave them extra rations, and sent them on a night march to circle around and position themselves to attack Mont Rey from the north, while the main relief army and Vercingetorix's garrison attacked everywhere else simultaneously. It was the best plan the Gauls could devise. Hit the weak point with overwhelming force while preventing the Romans from reinforcing it by keeping them busy along the entire perimeter. If they could break through at Mont Rey, they could roll up the Roman fortifications from behind, trap Caesar's army between Vercingetorix and the relief force, and turn the siege into a massacre. The attack began at noon, earlier than before, with the full relief army advancing against the outer fortifications along the entire front, while Vercingetorix simultaneously led his warriors out of Alesia against the inner walls. The noise was incredible, hundreds of thousands of warriors shouting battle cries, horns blowing, Roman trumpets answering, the clash of metal and the screams of the wounded creating a continuous roar that could be heard for miles. Along every sector of the walls, Romans and Gauls fought desperately, the Gauls trying to fill ditches and scale walls while Romans shot down at them with arrows and javelins, dropped stones and stabbed with spears. Caesar was everywhere, riding from sector to sector, his scarlet cloak making him visible to both his soldiers and the enemy, directing reserves to threatened points, personally leading counterattacks where the line wavered. But this was just the fixing attack. The real blow fell at Mont Rey, where the special assault force of 60,000 Gauls emerged from the forest and attacked the weak point in the Roman line with overwhelming force. The Roman cohorts stationed there, perhaps 3,000 men, found themselves facing odds of 20 to 1. The Gauls advanced with their siege equipment, filled the ditches methodically under covering fire from Gallic archers, pushed their screens forward, and began scaling the walls while Roman defenders fought frantically to hold them back. The cohorts at Mont Rey sent desperate messages to Caesar. They were being overwhelmed. The Gauls were breaking through. The line could not hold. Caesar pulled troops from the inner wall and rushed them north, but those sectors he weakened immediately came under heavier pressure from Vercingetorix, forcing him to send reserves there as well. The Romans were being stretched to breaking point, exactly as the Gauls had planned. At Mont Rey, the Gauls breached the Roman fortifications in several places, pouring through gaps in the palisade, engaging the defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat behind the walls. The Romans fell back, fighting for every foot, centurions dying as they tried to hold their men together, and it seemed the breakthrough the Gauls needed was finally happening. Then Caesar made a decision that would become legendary in Roman military history. He sent his best commander, Titus Labienus, with 6 cohorts of reserve troops to Mont Rey with orders to hold the position at all costs, and if necessary, to abandon the fortifications entirely and fight in the open rather than let the Gauls break through. Labienus was Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, a brilliant tactical commander in his own right, and he understood what was at stake. He led his cohorts at a run toward Mont Rey, while Caesar personally led 4 more cohorts and his cavalry around the outside of the fortifications to hit the Gallic assault force from behind. It was an insanely risky move. Caesar was taking his last reserves and committing them to a single decisive counterstrike, leaving other sectors of the wall dangerously undermanned. But he recognized that Mont Rey was where the battle would be won or lost. If the Gauls broke through there, nothing else mattered. If he could hold or recapture that sector, the coordinated Gallic assault would fail. Labienus arrived at Monterey to find a desperate situation. Roman cohorts had been pushed back from the walls, Gauls were flooding through multiple breaches, and only the disciplined fighting withdrawal of the Roman infantry had prevented total collapse. Labienus threw his fresh cohorts into the fight, and the Romans counterattacked, pushing back toward the fortifications in a savage melee. At the same moment, Caesar and his cavalry appeared on the Gallic flank, having ridden around the outside of the fortifications and charged into the rear of the Gallic assault force. The Gauls, focused on the breakthrough ahead of them, suddenly found themselves under attack from behind by Roman cavalry, Caesar himself visible in his scarlet cloak leading the charge. The psychological impact was devastating. The Gauls at Monterey had thought victory was in their grasp, and now they were caught between Labienus's counterattacking cohorts in front and Caesar's cavalry behind. Panic spread through the Gallic ranks, warriors in the rear turning to fight the cavalry while those in front tried to continue the assault, the coordination of the attack dissolving into chaos. Caesar's Germanic cavalry cut through the Gallic warriors with ruthless efficiency, and when the Gauls tried to retreat, they found themselves trapped against the very fortifications they had just breached. The assault at Monterey collapsed into a rout, Gallic warriors fleeing in all directions while Roman cavalry pursued them, cutting down thousands in the retreat. The rest of the relief army, watching their special assault force disintegrate, lost heart and began pulling back from their attacks along the perimeter. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix saw the relief army retreating and ordered his own warriors back up to the plateau, knowing that the coordinated assault had failed and that continuing to fight now would only waste lives. As sunset came on that terrible day, the battlefield around Alesia was carpeted with Gallic dead, the ditches filled with bodies, the ground soaked with blood, and the Roman fortifications, battered but intact, still stood. That night, the Gallic relief army held a council of war, and the decision they reached was brutal but inevitable. They could not break the Roman fortifications, they were running out of food themselves, and if they stayed longer they would accomplish nothing but their own starvation. The relief army began to disperse, warriors from each tribe heading back to their own territories. The great host that was supposed to save Gaul melting away into the night. By morning, the camps outside the Roman walls stood empty except for the wounded who could not travel, and Caesar's scouts reported that the relief force had abandoned the siege. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix and his warriors watched the relief army disappear and understood that they were now truly alone, that no help was coming, that the end was near. The food was completely gone. Warriors were dying of starvation, reduced to eating leather and boiled grass, the weakest already dead and their bodies thrown over the walls or left to rot in the streets. Vercingetorix called a council of his chieftains and laid out the impossible choices. They could attempt a final desperate breakout, which would be suicide against the intact Roman fortifications and would see most of them cut down. They could fight to the last man and woman, turning Alesia into a funeral pyre for Gallic independence. Or they could surrender and hope for mercy from Caesar. The chieftains argued through the night, some favoring death over submission, others arguing that preserving the lives of their warriors was more important than pride, and Vercingetorix listened to them all before making his decision. He would surrender himself to Caesar, and he would do it in a way that might save his warriors. The next morning, the gates of Alesia opened, and a single horseman emerged, riding slowly down the hillside toward the Roman fortifications. The rider was dressed in his finest armor, polished until it gleamed, a long cloak flowing behind him, every inch the image of a Gallic king, and he rode directly toward the raised platform where Caesar sat in judgment. It was Vercingetorix, and what happened next became one of the most famous scenes in Roman history, though the exact details are disputed because they come from Caesar's own account and later Roman historians who embellished the tale for dramatic effect. According to Caesar's version, Vercingetorix rode up to the platform, dismounted, removed his armor piece by piece, walked forward, and sat down at Caesar's feet in silence, a gesture of complete submission. Later Roman historians added more theatrical elements. That Vercingetorix circled Caesar's platform on horseback before dismounting, that he spoke words acknowledging Caesar as the greater warrior, that there was a long dramatic pause before Caesar accepted the surrender. The truth is we don't know exactly what was said or done, but we know what happened next. Caesar accepted Vercingetorix's surrender, had him placed in chains, and ordered the Gauls inside Alesia to lay down their weapons and come out to be taken prisoner. The siege of Alesia was over, and with it, the organized resistance to Roman rule in Gaul. The aftermath was characteristically brutal and calculated. Caesar spared most of the Gallic warriors from execution, not out of mercy but because live prisoners were more valuable than dead enemies. He distributed the prisoners to his legionaries as slaves, one captive to each soldier as a bonus, turning 80,000 defeated warriors into property to be sold or put to work. The Aedui and Arverni prisoners were treated differently. Caesar released them without ransom, a political move designed to win back the loyalty of these important tribes and demonstrate that submission to Rome would be rewarded. As for Vercingetorix, Caesar kept him in chains, sending him back to Rome to be paraded through the streets in Caesar's eventual triumph. Then imprisoned in the Tullianum, the underground dungeon beneath the Roman Forum, where he would languish for 6 years. In 46 BCE, when Caesar finally celebrated his triumph for the Gallic Wars, Vercingetorix was dragged through the streets of Rome in chains, displayed to the cheering Roman crowds as the embodiment of Gallic barbarism defeated, then taken back to his cell and strangled, his body thrown into the Tiber River or left in a mass grave. The sources disagree, but either way, the man who had come closest to ending Roman expansion into Gaul died alone and forgotten in a Roman prison cell, executed once he had served his purpose as a propaganda prop. History has been kinder to his memory than Rome was. French nationalists in the 19th century resurrected Vercingetorix as a symbol of resistance to foreign occupation, erecting a massive statue of him at the site of Alesia, and modern historians recognize him as a genuinely talented commander who understood that conventional tactics could not defeat Roman military superiority. But we should talk about what the victory at Alesia meant for Julius Caesar, because this is where the siege becomes not just a military event but a turning point in the history of the Roman Republic and Western civilization. The conquest of Gaul made Caesar fantastically wealthy. The sale of war captives alone brought in millions of sesterces, enough to pay off his massive debts and finance his political ambitions. More importantly, it gave him a veteran army fanatically loyal to him personally, legionaries who had followed him through 8 years of campaigning, who had grown rich on plunder, and who knew that their fortunes were tied to Caesar's political success. When Caesar finally sent his dispatches to Rome announcing the victory at Alesia and the end of major resistance in Gaul, the Senate decreed 20 days of public thanksgiving, an unprecedented honor, and Caesar's popularity with the Roman people soared. But his success terrified his enemies in Rome, particularly the conservative faction led by Cato and increasingly including his former ally Pompey, who saw Caesar's army and wealth as existential threats to their own power. The political crisis that would lead to civil war was already brewing. Caesar's governorship of Gaul was due to expire, and his enemies wanted him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, where he would be vulnerable to prosecution for various real and invented crimes committed during his consulship and governorship. Caesar insisted on his right to stand for consul again while remaining in Gaul with his army, which his enemies argued was unconstitutional and aimed at tyranny. The Senate, pushed by Caesar's enemies, issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, effectively a state of emergency, and demanded Caesar disband his legions or be declared an enemy of the state. Caesar's response was to cross the Rubicon River with his army in 49 BCE, the boundary beyond which no general was permitted to bring troops toward Rome, allegedly uttering the famous phrase Alia iacta est, the die is cast, and plunging Rome into civil war. None of this would have been possible without Alesia. The victory gave Caesar the military reputation, the veteran army, and the financial resources to challenge the Roman establishment. And when he defeated Pompey and the senatorial forces in the Civil War, the Roman Republic died and the Roman Empire was born, even if it took a few more decades and Caesar's assassination and his heir Augustus's consolidation of power for that transformation to become permanent. So let us examine the siege itself from a military perspective, because what Caesar accomplished at Alesia remains studied in military academies worldwide as a masterpiece of siege warfare and psychological dominance. The engineering alone was staggering. His legionaries built 25 miles of fortifications in about a month while under constant harassment, creating a defensive system so comprehensive that it effectively neutralized a 5-to-1 numerical disadvantage. But the engineering was only part of it. Caesar's true genius at Alesia was his understanding of logistics and psychology. He recognized that the Gauls' greatest strength, their numbers, was also their greatest weakness, that they could not feed or coordinate such massive forces for extended periods, and that if he could hold out long enough, their armies would disintegrate from within. The decision to refuse passage to the refugees from Alesia was militarily sound but morally horrifying, demonstrating that Caesar would sacrifice any conventional notion of mercy or honor if it served his tactical advantage. He was fighting not just to defeat the Gauls but to break their will, to demonstrate that resistance to Rome was futile, that even the mightiest Gallic confederation was no match for Roman discipline and Roman ruthlessness. The Gallic failure at Alesia reveals much about the limitations of tribal warfare against professional armies. Vercingetorix had united the tribes in unprecedented fashion, implemented a sophisticated strategy, and commanded loyalty from warriors across Gaul. But the Gallic military system had fatal weaknesses that no amount of courage or numbers could overcome. The Gauls lacked professional logistics. Their armies lived by foraging and plunder, which worked for short campaigns but collapsed during extended operations. They lacked engineering expertise. While they could build impressive hill forts for defense, they had no answer to Roman siege engineering and could not construct or counter the kind of elaborate fortifications Caesar built at Alesia. They lacked strategic coordination. The relief army was a coalition of tribal contingents under multiple chiefs who had to reach decisions by council, unlike Caesar, who commanded with single authority and could shift reserves and change tactics instantly. And crucially, the Gauls fought for glory and freedom, powerful motivators but ones that encouraged individual heroism over collective discipline, whereas the Romans fought for pay, land, and loyalty to their commander, creating an army where individual soldiers subordinated their egos to unit cohesion and followed orders even in desperate circumstances. These structural advantages explain how Rome conquered not just Gaul but most of the known world. The Roman military system, professional soldiers serving long terms, standardized training and equipment, sophisticated logistics, engineering expertise, and unified command, was simply superior to any tribal or even most sophisticated state militaries of the ancient world. Individual Roman soldiers were not necessarily better fighters than Gallic warriors, and in fact, the Gauls probably had advantages in physical strength and individual combat skill. But war is not about individual combat. It is about systems, logistics, coordination, and the ability to project and sustain military force over time and distance. The Romans had perfected these things, and Alesia demonstrated the result. A numerically inferior force defeating a vastly larger enemy through superior organization and ruthless calculation. But we should also acknowledge that Vercingetorix came closer to defeating Caesar than anyone else in the Gallic Wars, and his strategy was fundamentally sound. If he had maintained the scorched earth approach, avoiding the cavalry battle that led to his retreat into Alesia, Caesar's army might well have disintegrated over the winter of 52 to 51 BCE, isolated in hostile territory with supply lines cut and reinforcements unavailable. The decision to accept battle and then to fortify at Alesia were tactical errors, but they were errors born of political pressure from Vercingetorix's tribal allies who wanted decisive action and from the psychological burden of asking his people to burn their own towns and fields. Leadership in coalition warfare is always complicated by the need to maintain political support from allies with different interests and perspectives, and Vercingetorix faced the impossible task of maintaining Gallic unity while implementing a strategy that required painful sacrifices. In the end, the political constraints of leading a tribal coalition defeated him as much as Caesar's tactical brilliance did. The siege also showcases Caesar's gift for propaganda and self-mythologizing, a talent that would serve him throughout his career and that shapes how we understand these events even today. Our primary source for the Siege of Alesia is Caesar's own Commentariae de Bello Gallico, his commentaries on the Gallic War, written in third-person narrative as if an objective historical account, but actually a carefully crafted piece of political propaganda designed to justify his actions to Roman audiences and glorify his achievements. Caesar probably exaggerated the numbers of the Gallic forces. Modern historians doubt the relief army was quite as enormous as he claimed, and he certainly portrayed his own decisions in the most favorable light possible. The scene of Vercingetorix surrendering at his feet is described in Caesar's own account, which makes it suspect as objective history. Caesar had every reason to make the surrender as dramatic and humiliating for the Gauls as possible. But even accounting for exaggeration and self-serving narrative, the basic facts of what happened at Alesia are supported by archaeology. Excavations at the site of Alesia have confirmed the existence of the Roman fortifications and found artifacts consistent with a massive siege, and by the undeniable result. After Alesia, organized Gallic resistance collapsed, and within a year, Caesar had pacified the region sufficiently to turn his attention back to politics in Rome. We should also consider the siege from the perspective of the common soldiers and civilians who lived through it, because the surviving historical accounts focus on generals and grand strategy, while largely ignoring the lived experience of the hundreds of thousands of people caught up in these events. For the Roman legionaries, the siege meant weeks of backbreaking labor building fortifications on half rations, followed by days of brutal combat against overwhelming numbers, knowing that if the walls were breached, there would be no retreat and no mercy. The legionaries were professionals who understood the stakes, but they were also human beings who must have felt fear as they watched the massive Gallic relief army arrive and camp just outside their fortifications, calculating the odds and understanding how outnumbered they truly were. Their morale held because they trusted Caesar. He had led them to victory again and again. He shared their hardships on campaign, and he rewarded success generously. But also because Roman military discipline meant that desertion or disobedience meant flogging or execution, creating powerful incentives to stand and fight even in desperate circumstances. For the Gallic warriors trapped inside Alesia, the siege meant a slow descent into starvation and despair, watching their food supplies dwindle, eating their horses and pack animals, then reduced to boiling leather and foraging for edible plants, all while knowing that their families and communities depended on them to somehow survive and fight. The decision to expel the civilians from Alesia must have been agonizing for the warriors who had wives, children, and elderly parents among the refugees. And then they had to watch from the walls as their loved ones died slowly in no man's land, refused by both sides, their cries for help echoing across the valley. The psychological torture of that experience is difficult to imagine, and it speaks to Vercingetorix's leadership that he maintained enough control to prevent mass desertions or premature surrender attempts. When the relief army finally attacked and then failed to break through, the warriors in Alesia must have felt utter hopelessness, knowing that help had come so close and still failed, that they would now starve to death or surrender to an enemy who had shown no mercy. For the civilians, the refugees expelled from Alesia and the families in the Gallic relief army's camp, the siege was pure nightmare. The refugees died slowly, visibly, their suffering used as a weapon of war by both sides. The families who traveled with the relief army, because Gallic armies often moved with baggage trains that included women, children, and elders, experienced the trauma of watching their warriors march into hopeless assaults against impregnable fortifications. Then the despair of the retreat and the dangerous journey home through a countryside devastated by years of war. We have no direct accounts from these civilians because ancient historians rarely bothered to record the perspectives of ordinary people, especially non-Romans, but archaeology and common sense tell us that the suffering was immense. Gaul's population declined dramatically during the war years, And while combat deaths account for some of this, disease, starvation, and displacement killed far more. The environmental impact of the siege and the broader Gallic Wars is also worth considering, though ancient sources pay it little attention. Caesar's scorched earth campaigns and Vercingetorix's defensive scorching meant that huge swaths of Gaul's agricultural land were deliberately destroyed, crops burned, livestock slaughtered, and villages razed. The massive armies, hundreds of thousands of men plus horses and pack animals, stripped the countryside of food and resources wherever they moved, and the movement of that many people and animals would have spread disease and disrupted ecosystems. The forests around Alesia were probably extensively logged to provide timber for the Roman fortifications and siege equipment, and the battlefield itself would have been so thoroughly trampled and churned up that it would have taken years for vegetation to recover. These environmental impacts rippled through Gallic society for years after the war ended, contributing to food shortages and economic disruption that made Roman occupation easier because people were too desperate and exhausted to resist. Let us also examine the broader historical context of the Gallic Wars and why they mattered so much to both sides. For Rome, Gaul represented wealth, land for settlement, military glory, and strategic security. The Roman Republic was in the midst of a political crisis driven by massive inequality, where a small aristocratic elite controlled most of the wealth and land while ordinary Roman citizens struggled economically and politically. The Senate's power was being challenged by populist politicians like Caesar who promised land redistribution and debt relief to the masses. Military conquest offered a solution. Wealthy provinces to tax, land to distribute to veterans, slaves to fuel the economy, and glory to win popular support. Caesar understood this perfectly and used the Gallic Wars to create both the military and economic power base he needed to challenge the senatorial oligarchy. For the soldiers, Gaul meant plunder, slaves, and land grants upon discharge, opportunities for social mobility that were otherwise unavailable to poor Romans. The Gallic Wars were not just about conquest. They were about using conquest to reshape Roman politics and society. For the Gauls, the stakes were even higher: the survival of their way of life and political independence. Gallic society was complex and sophisticated, with large oppida, fortified urban centers, thriving agriculture and trade networks, skilled craftsmanship in metalwork and art, and political systems ranging from monarchies to oligarchic councils depending on the tribe. The Gauls were not barbarians in any meaningful sense. They had writing, coinage, laws, and civilization just different from the Roman model. Roman conquest meant the destruction of this indigenous political and cultural system and its replacement with Roman law, Roman taxation, Roman language, and Roman gods. Over the following centuries, Gallic culture would be systematically Romanized, the Gallic language would be replaced by Latin, and Gallic identity would be subsumed into the Roman Empire. This cultural genocide, because that's effectively what it was not accidental but deliberate Roman policy, though the Romans framed it as bringing civilization to barbarians. Vercingetorix and his warriors were fighting not just for political independence but for cultural survival, and their defeat at Alesia marked the beginning of the end for independent Gallic civilization. The military innovations at Alesia influenced siege warfare for centuries. The double wall strategy, circumvallation and contravallation, became a standard Roman technique for besieging fortified positions when relief forces were expected, used repeatedly in later Roman campaigns. The elaborate field fortifications and obstacles demonstrated the effectiveness of prepared defenses over numerical superiority, a lesson that would be relearned countless times throughout military history. Caesar's willingness to accept tactical risk for strategic advantage, deliberately placing his army in a position where retreat was impossible to force both his soldiers and his enemies into decisive action, became a hallmark of aggressive generalship, though it's a strategy that leads to disaster as often as to victory. The psychological warfare, using the suffering of refugees as a weapon, prefigured the total war strategies of modern conflicts where civilian suffering is deliberately inflicted to break enemy morale. All of these elements appear and reappear in military history, from medieval sieges to modern warfare, demonstrating that while technology changes, fundamental principles of human conflict remain surprisingly constant. But perhaps the most important legacy of Alesia is what it represented. The moment when it became clear that the Roman Republic's expansion would not be stopped by military resistance, that Rome's systematic approach to warfare, its professional military, and its ruthless willingness to do whatever was necessary for victory made it effectively unstoppable by any contemporary power. This realization spread throughout the ancient world after Alesia, affecting how other peoples and states responded to Rome. Some chose accommodation and alliance, becoming client states rather than enemies, hoping to preserve some autonomy by accepting Roman suzerainty voluntarily. Others chose resistance and suffered the same fate as Gaul. But increasingly, independent resistance seemed futile, and Roman expansion continued until it encompassed the entire Mediterranean basin and much of Europe, reaching its greatest extent in the 2nd century CE. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, brought stability and prosperity to much of this territory, but it was a peace built on conquest and maintained by the constant threat of overwhelming military force, a reality that Alesia demonstrated with brutal clarity. The death of Vercingetorix in that Roman dungeon 6 years after his surrender deserves some reflection, because it exemplifies how Rome treated defeated enemies who had seriously challenged Roman power. Caesar could have executed Vercingetorix immediately after the surrender, but he kept him alive specifically to display in his triumph, because Roman triumphs were propaganda spectacles designed to celebrate military victory and Roman superiority. Leading enemy commanders would be paraded through the streets in chains, displayed to the Roman crowd as evidence of Rome's might and the general's glory, then executed afterward once they had served their purpose. This was standard practice, not unusual cruelty, but it meant that Vercingetorix spent 6 years in captivity knowing exactly how and when he would die, waiting for Caesar to finally get around to celebrating his triumph. A psychological torture that might have been worse than immediate execution. When the triumph finally happened, Vercingetorix was probably in his late 30s or early 40s, weakened by years of imprisonment, paraded before crowds who jeered and celebrated his defeat, then strangled in the traditional manner. No Roman recorded his final words or thoughts. He was simply disposed of once he had served his purpose as a symbol in someone else's story. We should also acknowledge the irony that Caesar himself would be assassinated less than 2 years after Vercingetorix's execution, stabbed to death in the Senate by men who feared he was destroying the Republic and establishing a monarchy. In a sense, both men were casualties of the same historical transformation. The Roman Republic's evolution into an empire, a process that required the conquest of Gaul to provide the resources and military power, but that also destabilized the Republic's political system to the breaking point. Caesar's success made him too powerful for the Republic to contain, and his assassination triggered another round of civil wars that ended with his adopted heir Augustus establishing the Roman Empire openly. Vercingetorix fought to preserve Gallic independence and lost. The Roman senators fought to preserve republican government and also lost. Caesar won the Gallic Wars but lost his life to the political chaos his success created. The only real winners were the legionaries who got their land grants and the people of Rome who got entertainment and free grain paid for with Gallic plunder, plus the long-term historical winner, the Roman Empire, which would dominate Western civilization for centuries and shape European culture permanently. The archaeological excavations at Alesia have provided fascinating physical evidence of the siege, turning Caesar's literary account into tangible reality. French archaeologists beginning in the 19th century and continuing to today have uncovered sections of the Roman fortifications, found Roman and Gallic weapons and equipment, excavated the ditches and obstacle systems, and even found the remains of siege engines and fortification timbers preserved in wet soil. These discoveries confirm the basic accuracy of Caesar's description while also revealing details he didn't mention, like the specific construction techniques used for the fortifications and the debris of everyday life during the siege, broken pottery, animal bones, coins, personal items. The excavations also found evidence of the Gallic settlement on Mont Auxois, confirming this was indeed ancient Alesia, and revealed that the site had been occupied for centuries before the siege, with sophisticated Gallic fortifications of its own that predated the Roman siege. Walking the site today, you can still trace the contours of the Roman walls, look down from Mont Auxois to the valleys below where the refugees died, and climb to Mont Rey where the decisive battle was fought. It's a sobering experience, standing where tens of thousands died in a conflict that determined the future of Western Europe. Modern historians debate various aspects of the siege, particularly the numbers involved and the extent of Gallic suffering. As mentioned, Caesar probably exaggerated the size of the relief army. Logistical studies suggest that feeding and coordinating 240,000 warriors plus their support personnel would have been nearly impossible with ancient technology and organization. More realistic estimates place the relief army at perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 warriors, still vastly outnumbering the Romans but not quite the overwhelming horde Caesar described. The debate matters because it affects our assessment of Caesar's achievement. If the numbers were smaller, the victory is less impressive militarily but still strategically decisive. Similarly, historians debate the extent of Gallic casualties and suffering, with estimates of total deaths during the 8 years of Gallic wars ranging from several 100,000 to over 1 million. Caesar himself claimed to have killed or enslaved millions, but this was probably propagandistic exaggeration. What's undeniable is that the war was catastrophic for Gauls' population and economy, setting back Gallic development by generations and enabling complete Roman domination. There's also scholarly debate about Vercingetorix himself and whether he was as unified a leader as later French nationalism portrayed him. Some historians argue that Vercingetorix's authority over the tribal coalition was always tenuous, that he had to constantly negotiate with other chiefs, and that his strategic decisions were often compromised by political necessity. Others see him as a genuinely visionary leader who understood modern warfare better than his contemporaries and whose strategy would have worked if he had been given full authority to implement it without political interference. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Vercingetorix was clearly an exceptional leader to achieve the unity he did, but he also operated within a Gallic political system that made unified command difficult and that ultimately contributed to his defeat. The cultural impact of Alesia extended far beyond the immediate historical events. The siege became central to the mythology of both French nationalism and Roman imperial identity. For the French, Vercingetorix represented the first French resistance to foreign occupation, a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds that resonated especially during periods of foreign invasion or occupation. His image was invoked during the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, and especially during World War II and the Resistance. Napoleon III commissioned archaeological excavations at Alesia and erected a huge statue of Vercingetorix on Mont Auxois, explicitly connecting his own regime to Gallic resistance and French nationalism. For the Romans and later European imperial powers, Alesia represented the triumph of civilization over barbarism, disciplined professional military force over undisciplined tribal warriors, and justified conquest as bringing progress and civilization to backward peoples. Both interpretations are historically simplistic and politically motivated, but they demonstrate how military events get transformed into mythology and used for contemporary political purposes centuries after the original participants are dead. In conclusion, the Siege of Alesia in 52 BCE was one of the decisive military engagements in Western history, the moment when Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul was secured, when Gallic independence was effectively ended, and when Caesar acquired the military reputation and veteran army that would enable him to challenge the Roman Republic itself. From a military perspective, it demonstrated the superiority of Roman discipline, engineering, and systematic warfare over numerical advantage and individual courage. From a human perspective, it was a catastrophe. Tens of thousands dead, civilians dying of starvation as weapons of war, 80,000 warriors enslaved, and a civilization beginning its transformation from independence to subjugation. Vercingetorix came closer than any Gallic leader before or after to defeating Roman expansion, and his ultimate failure was as much about the structural limitations of tribal warfare and coalition politics as about any individual failing. Julius Caesar revealed himself at Alesia to be not just a brilliant general but a ruthless pragmatist willing to sacrifice any conventional morality or mercy to achieve victory, a characteristic that would serve him in the civil wars to come but that would also inspire the fear and hatred that led to his assassination. The refugees dying between the walls while two armies watched remain one of history's most haunting images of calculated cruelty in service of military objectives. The fortifications remain one of history's most impressive engineering achievements, proof that sometimes the spade is mightier than the sword. And the broader consequences, the Romanization of Gaul, the end of the Republic, the rise of Imperial Rome, the cultural transformation of Western Europe, all flow directly from those desperate weeks when two armies and two civilizations collided on the plains around a hilltop fortress in central Gaul. Alesia was where the ancient world's old order died and a new order was born, where the last great attempt to resist Roman expansion was broken, and where one of history's most capable commanders demonstrated that genius, ruthlessness, and preparation could overcome almost any odds. The siege was Rome's greatest victory and Gaul's greatest tragedy, and both assessments are true, because history's most significant moments are rarely simple stories of good versus evil, but rather complex collisions of interests, ambitions, and human choices that echo across centuries, shaping the world we inherit long after the original participants have turned to dust and their names have become symbols rather than people, remembered not for who they truly were but for what they came to represent in the endless human struggle for power, survival, and meaning.